Chelsea, Everton, Aston Villa, Nottingham Forest, Leicester City, and Newcastle United. What do they all have in common? That's right, they are all great institutions of the English game, all former English champions no less. But there is something else. They have also all flirted with, or actually had PSR breaches in recent years, and there has also been what we will just call for now an unusual amount of transfer business done between them. Oh, come on, Alfie, I hear you say. What is this, the Matt Letizia podcast? Stop being so conspiratorial. How much transfer business can there really have been between just 6 Premier League clubs? Well, let's see. In the last 3 seasons alone, 26 transfers, including loanees, and obviously, we still have 1 transfer window remaining this season. So that is quite a lot. Due to the way in which accounting works in football, and how profit and loss are measured for regulatory purposes, we have seen clubs become increasingly, well, again, shall we just say, inventive in recent years when it comes to exploiting various loopholes. There are clubs with lucrative commercial arrangements with companies which just so happen to have very close ties to their ownership. We have seen clubs sell their most valuable academy graduates, who can be booked as pure profit, and, especially in the Championship, over a number of years, we have even seen clubs selling their own stadiums, typically to their owners or to companies controlled by their owners, in order to provide the club with a massive one-off windfall. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? Chelsea even started handing out 35-year contracts to newborns, tying them down until retirement, as a way of spreading their transfer fees out for as long as possible and minimising the booked upfront cost in a process known as amortisation. One by one, various governing bodies adjusted their PSR or FFP rules in an attempt to create better incentive structures and restrict acts that flagrantly violated the spirit of the regulations, if not the actual letter of them. It's not exactly conspiratorial, therefore, to imagine that football clubs might engage in shady financial acts to circumvent rules and regulations. In actual fact, we know perfectly well that they do. Nor do I think is it particularly outlandish to suggest that after the first 7 loopholes were stitched up, not all football clubs were likely to stop there, say, fair enough, you got us, and stop looking for new ones. But what is the conspiracy here exactly? Well, just as Chelsea 6, 7 and, in Cole Palmer's case, following a 2-year extension, 9-year contracts, exploited the benefits of amortisation in spreading out the cost of a signing, simply selling players, the proceeds of which can be booked immediately, and buying new ones, with the cost spread out over a maximum of 5 years now, following new rules voted for by the Premier League, allows clubs to book significant accounting profits, even if the net spend on those 2 transfers is either negative or neutral. I'll give you an example, and conveniently, not a hypothetical one. Last June, Everton announced the signing of Aston Villa Academy graduate Tim Arogbenam for an undisclosed fee, and just 1 day later, Aston Villa announced the signing of Everton Academy graduate Lewis Dobbin, also for an undisclosed fee. Arogbenam and Dobbin have an awful lot in common. They're both talented young players, aged 21, they've both been capped by England at multiple youth levels, and they've both had successful loan stints in the FL, Arogbenam at Queen's Park Rangers, and Dobbin at Derby County. They are also both, one could be forgiven for thinking, pawns in their boyhood club's financial planning. It is reported that the undisclosed fees for Arogbenam and Dobbin were both around £9 million. On the face of it, it doesn't make much sense. Why swap your academy graduate for another club's academy graduate? Especially one that you internally rate highly. Typically, clubs are supposed to hang on to their most talented homegrown players with dear life. They cost nothing, fans love them, and they have an innate understanding of the club, unlike most outsiders. What's more, there was no suggestion that either Arogbenam or Dobbin were pushing for moves, and it's not even like Everton or Villa just wanted a different profile of player or someone who plays in a different position to fix an existing problem in their first team. Before the season had even started, Aston Villa had sent Dobbin straight out on loan to West Brom. Meanwhile, Arogbenam is still at Everton, but he hasn't made any of their last 8 matchday squads. The sporting motive for this move, if you like, would appear to be almost non-existent. Also, given that the deals were completed at almost the exact same moment, somewhat conspicuously, just before the Premier League's profit and sustainability accounting deadline on June 30th, as is the case with a lot of signings that we are going to look at, and reportedly for almost the exact same fee, one could ask the question, why not just do it as an old school swap deal, of the kind that we used to see on a semi-regular basis, either as a direct swap or with a little sweetener thrown in by the club who is deemed to be signing the more valuable asset? The answer, of course, is because a direct swap deal would do little to aid either Everton or Aston Villa's efforts to avoid breaching PSR. Selling each other an academy graduate for £9 million by contrast, well, that is £9 million of pure profit right there that goes straight into their 2023-24 accounts. Meanwhile, Arogbenham, signed on a 3-year deal, is only reported as a £3 million expense for the 2023-24 season. Dobbin's contract length wasn't actually reported by Aston Villa, but assuming that it was the maximum 5 years allowed now, that would bring his 2023-24 cost down to just £1.8 million. In other words, then, you have sold a 21-year-old academy graduate for £9 million, bought someone else's 21-year-old academy graduate, also for £9 million, which is obviously a neutral net spend overall, but in that season's accounts, squeezed in right before the deadline, and therefore for the 3-year period relevant to potential PSR breaches up to that point, you could book a more than £7 million profit on those two net neutral transactions. Tim Arogbenham and Lewis Dobbin might go on to become excellent players for Everton and Aston Villa. They are both talented young players. It is eminently plausible, but that wasn't, I think that it is reasonable to assume, the principal reason why they were signed by Everton and Aston Villa a week before the Premier League's profit and sustainability accounting deadline, and in that sense, this represents a new type of transfer, and yet another accounting trick, which occupies a certain moral grey area. Arguably, from a moral or ethical point of view, this is actually the most dubious trick yet. Selling a stadium is dangerous to a club's future viability and sustainability, making them less self-sufficient and more reliant upon the whims of a private investor, and opaque sponsorship arrangements are dishonest, potentially to the point of constituting cheating, but they are, individually, directly at least, relatively victimless. Chelsea's lifelong contracts, on the other hand, are actually beneficial to individuals meanwhile, namely the players who are receiving unfathomable long-term financial guarantees, even if that wasn't Chelsea's primary motive. These transfers, however, are not always victimless. Footballers being treated as pawns and there being very little loyalty in football, from either players or clubs, is obviously nothing new. But at least the disloyalty was previously a genuine one, rather than players being moved around like pieces on a chessboard at the whims of accountants rather than coaches or sporting directors. There are many such examples. In some instances, these are marriages of convenience or mutually beneficial deals, as some Premier League clubs have internally started referring to them, without any clear evidence of harm. Brighton, for example, genuinely wanted to sign Yankuba Minte following an excellent season on loan at Feyenoord. They had a great deal of PSR wriggle room this summer following a series of massive sales, and Newcastle United were in dire need of cash to avoid a likely points deduction. Minte's £30 million move from St James's Park to the Amex, therefore, without ever having played a game for Newcastle, wouldn't fall into the same category as the Arogbenham and Dobbin quasi-swap deal, but it is still a transfer that only came about because of PSR. Minte didn't want to leave Newcastle, Eddie Howe didn't want to sell him, and the intention of both player and manager was that Minte would have been involved with the first team at Newcastle United this season. The same goes for Elliot Anderson, an even more painful one for Newcastle United fans, as a talented young Geordie and boyhood Newcastle fan who was sold on the same day as Minte for a reported £35 million. Anderson made 53 appearances for Newcastle over the last 2 seasons, featuring in more games than Sven Botman, Harvey Barnes and Nick Pope last season, and there was every indication that, had he stuck around this season, he would have played an even more important part, still aged only 21. Well, He has since turned 22, but he was 21 at the time of the move. Anderson was even more reluctant to move on, understandably, given his ties to the club and the fact that he was routinely involved, so he had little personal incentive to leave. His first team prospects are arguably no better at Nottingham Forest than they were at Newcastle, owing to competition at Forest in his favoured number 10 role from Morgan Gibbs-White. Newcastle, however, despite rating Anderson highly, effectively had to force him out, with the youngster knowing that if he were to refuse, he would open himself up to be blamed for a potential 10-point deduction, or for Newcastle being forced to sell one of the three players that they most desperately fought to keep hold of over the summer, namely Alexander Isak, Anthony Gordon, and Bruno Guimaraes. You don't need to cry for Elliot Anderson. He will be paid very handsomely by Nottingham Forest, and has started very well there. But it is not a situation that a club like Newcastle United ought to be putting one of their most talented academy graduates in. When it comes to forcing out promising academy graduates, though, no club quite does it like Chelsea. In fairness, Chelsea have used their excellent academy and enormous loan farming system, and the revenue from selling academy players to navigate even more primitive FFP regulations for an awfully long time, as Roman Abramovich sought more novel means of revenue generation after restrictions were imposed upon him writing blank cheques. Since the 2011-12 season, when UEFA FFP rules were first introduced, no team has raised more transfer revenue through player sales in all of world football than Chelsea's €1.67 billion, narrowly ahead of Benfica's €1.61 billion, far ahead of the next highest Big Five league club, Juventus, with €1.31 billion, and miles clear of the next highest Premier League club, Manchester City's, barely €1 billion. It can be difficult to make sense of such enormous numbers, but in 13 years, Chelsea have raised €650 million more in player sales than Manchester City, €800 million more than Liverpool, and €1 billion more than Arsenal, fueling much of their €2.92 billion transfer expenditure during that time. Well done, Alfie. You really managed to simplify those big numbers there. While we've seen that from Chelsea for a long time, what we have seen more recently are the sales of academy graduates actively involved in the club's first team, like Conor Gallagher, Mason Mount, and, to a lesser extent, Lewis Hall, rather than serial loanees like Patrick Bamford or Tomasz Kalas. No one played more games or more minutes in the Premier League for Chelsea than Conor Gallagher last season, and it wasn't even close. Gallagher started a remarkable 37 of Chelsea's 38 Premier League games, captaining them in 30 of them, playing 3,137 minutes of Premier League football in total. Meanwhile, no other Chelsea player started more than 33 Premier League games, and no one else played more than 3,000 minutes. The fact that Gallagher, unlike, say, Mykhailo Mudryk or Wesley Fofana, could be booked as pure profit in the event of a sale in Chelsea's accounts, made it economically expedient to sell Gallagher when Atletico Madrid offered the Blues a reported €40 million for their most used player last season and one of their best academy graduates of his generation. Gallagher's replacement at Chelsea, in many ways, was Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall, brought in to beef up Chelsea's depth in midfield following Gallagher's departure, as a familiar face that Enzo Maresca could trust, having coached him last season at Leicester. It is fitting, therefore, in the context of this discussion, that Dewsbury-Hall was also a Leicester City Academy graduate, meaning that his sale, like Gallagher's, could be booked as pure profit. He didn't want to leave, looking forward to being the talisman for his boyhood club and captaining them in the Premier League following promotion, rather than being a bit part player at Chelsea, and his sale was also seemingly snuck in just before the PSR accounting deadline, at a club that only avoided a points deduction following a PSR breach by virtue of an appeal in September, and was at risk of breaching the loss limit again. Leicester City, meanwhile, signed 18-year-old Michael Golding from Chelsea, who had only ever played 1 minute of senior football for the Blues, or indeed for anyone, when he came on as an injury-time substitute when Chelsea were already 4-0 up, against Preston North End in the FA Cup. Golding is yet to play a single minute of football for the Foxes. If £5 million seems like a lot for someone who has never kicked a ball at senior first-team level, you are going to have to brace yourself as we come to Amari Kellyman. having already paid £20 million for then 18-year-old Aston Villa Academy graduate Carney Chukwuemeka in the summer of 2022, who had made a grand total of 2 Premier League starts at Villa Park. Last summer, Chelsea set a new record fee for a signing who went straight into their development squad, rather than their first team, forking out £19 million for then 18, now 19-year-old winger, Amari Kellyman, who had not only never started a Premier League game at Aston Villa, his Premier League career consisted, and still consists, of a grand total of 35 minutes of football, which came in the form of second-half substitute appearances against Manchester City and Crystal Palace in 4-1 and 5-0 defeats. The record that Kellyman broke, as the most expensive Chelsea signing to go straight into the club's development squad, was £4 million for Ishe Samuel Smith, who, you guessed it, was signed from another one of our sensational 6 PSR conscious clubs, Everton, having never played a single minute of first-team football at any level last season. Chelsea would argue that they are paying for future potential with Kellyman, not past performances, and point to the success and prior first-team experience, or lack thereof, of star man Cole Palmer. A lot of people commented that the £40 million that Chelsea paid for Palmer, plus £2.5 million in add-ons, was excessive at the time, given that he had only played 358 minutes of Premier League football for Manchester City the previous season, and was yet to score a goal in the Premier League. Now Palmer is Chelsea's best player, one of the world's best players. He has scored over 30 Premier League goals, and £42.5 million looks like an absolute bargain. Indeed, that is the exact argument that some Chelsea sources are reported to have made. It is a compelling one on the face of it, but in reality, Cole Palmer, while he has exceeded any and all expectations at Chelsea, there can be no doubt about that, had played almost 1,500 minutes of football for the best team in England, if not in Europe. He had scored Manchester City's only goal, and a lovely goal it was too, in the Community Shield against Arsenal at Wembley, and he had won the Under-21 Euros as a starman with England. Amari Kellyman, by contrast, and I am not suggesting by any means that he is not talented or couldn't go on to reach great heights within the game, I am just pointing out the flaws in the comparisons that are made between Palmer and him, had played a grand total of 148 minutes of first-team football, so 10 times less than Palmer. He has only ever represented England up to under-19 level, and he only actually joined Aston Villa from Derby County 2 years ago for just £600,000. What's more, it feels relevant to point out that Cole Palmer was kept out of the Manchester City team by the likes of Phil Foden and Kevin De Bruyne. There are not many comparisons in terms of difficulty making a starting 11 in a specific position in all of world football. But then, who is to say what Amari Kellyman, or anyone else for that matter, is really worth? And that is why this is potentially such an effective avenue, if a little inelegant and uneasy one, for clubs to potentially explore. Value is extremely difficult to define in football. Clubs, routinely, pay what might seem like insane fees for players in good faith, making it difficult to tell, or at least difficult to prove instances, where those fees were not in good faith. There is a great deal of plausible deniability. I have to state, not just for legal reasons, but because I lack the evidence to conclusively prove anything, but, mainly for legal reasons, that no one, least of all me, No chance, Gov, is suggesting any wrongdoing on the part of these 6 clubs relating to any of these transfers, or any others mentioned in this video, or anywhere else. Basically, no one has ever done anything wrong, and if they have, it wasn't me that said they did, alright? When asked about these deals officially, all of the clubs involved have refused to comment. Sources, meanwhile, have provided a range of different responses. Supposing, purely hypothetically, that the Timur Ogberum to Everton and Lewis Dobbin to Aston Villa deals were some kind of conspiracy, crazy as that may sound, theoretically, Everton and Aston Villa could have paid each other £39 million rather than the reported £9 million and made a massive positive dent in their PSR numbers. Chelsea could have paid Aston Villa £50 million for Amari Kellyman, while Aston Villa could have paid Chelsea £68.5 million for Ian Maatsen. The difference between the two deals would still have been £18.5 million, as it was, but the pair of them could have booked much higher instant income while amortising the significantly higher outgoing and without materially altering the terms of the overall transaction. Supposing that was their intent though, £50 and £68.5 million probably would have been testing the bounds of plausible deniability, keeping things moderately believable where one could at least make a compelling case for the fees involved, even if they might have seemed inherently suspicious to some, would be wise. You could skirt under the radar for years, there might be the odd easily ignored murmur of discontent from losers like me on the internet, but nothing that could ever genuinely stop you in your tracks. Enter Odysseos Vlachodimos. Earlier on in this video, I talked about Elliot Anderson's reported £35 million summer move to Nottingham Forest, and that is the figure that has been most widely cited and would appear to be accurate. However, when the deal actually happened, the Daily Telegraph reported the fee as being, and I quote, around £15 million. That is interesting because, firstly, 15 million is very different to 35 million. That is not a rounding error, it's less than half the amount widely reported elsewhere, but also because it is the exact amount that the deal would have been worth if you were to deduct the £20 million that Newcastle United paid on the exact same day for Nottingham Forest goalkeeper Odysseos Vlachodimos, who, completely normally and not at all strangely in any way, shape or form, Newcastle didn't want, and during the same window that they made him their most expensive goalkeeper of all time, they told him that he was free to leave the club. Nottingham Forest reportedly paid a shade over £4 million up front for Vlachodimos from Benfica, and if you're wondering what he had done to more than quadruple his value in less than 12 months, allow me to explain. Vlachodimos didn't start the season in goal for Forest, playing second fiddle behind Matt Turner. Then he was brought in for 5 league games. He played terribly. He got dropped. He was relegated to third choice then, behind Turner and former Newcastle number 2 in the Championship, Matt Sells, and turned 30. And if you can't see how that would increase someone's value from £4 to £20 million, well then, I'm afraid I simply cannot help you. Newcastle made Vlachodimos the 20th most expensive goalkeeper of all time, above Jan Oblak, Mike Maignan, and Emiliano Martinez, and the second most expensive ever, over the age of 30. He is Newcastle's 14th most expensive signing in any position, ahead of Alan Saint-Maximin, Jorginho Wijnaldum, and Alan Shearer. And yet, the German-born Greek international has only made 3 Premier League matchday squads this season. That is squads, to be clear, not starts or appearances. He hasn't made any of those. And that was only during the 3 games where Newcastle number 2 Martin Dubravka was sidelined with a knee injury. Whilst value in football can be nebulous and hard to determine, you would do well to find anyone in the sport who would tell you with a straight face that a goalkeeper, over the age of 30, who had struggled following a £4 million move, who neither the buying nor the selling club wanted, was worth £20 million. In that sense, Newcastle have somewhat overplayed their hand. The Magpies reportedly only realised 2 days before the PSR deadline that they had to raise £60 million in order to avoid a likely points deduction. How they could realise that late on is an entirely different question, and were desperate to A, avoid a potential 10-point deduction, obviously, and B, keep hold of Isak, Gordon and Guimaraes. Everton and Brighton both reportedly came in for Minte. Meanwhile, Nottingham Forest were keen when they heard about Elliot Anderson's availability, but they wanted something in return. Newcastle sought a mutually beneficial deal, with Forest wideman Anthony Elanga one of 3 targets for Newcastle's right wing identified by Eddie Howe and his team, along with Jared Bowen and Noni Madueke, but Forest weren't interested in selling Elanga, nor were they interested in signing Miguel Almiron, who insiders say Newcastle also tried to shoehorn into the deal. A day before the deadline, knowing Newcastle were becoming increasingly desperate, Forest said that they'd do the deal if Newcastle signed Vlachodimos. There was seemingly little to no thought or consideration given to whether Vlachodimos himself wanted to go from being third choice at Nottingham Forest to third or fourth choice at Newcastle United, despite being his country's number one, coming into the prime of his career, 30 as a keeper, and having played over 200 games for Benfica. Reluctantly, Newcastle agreed, with the £65 million generated for Anderson and Minte, enough to steer them clear of a breach and a deduction while keeping hold of their most prized assets. The fee for Vlachodimos was so egregious, however, and so obviously deemed to be inflated by most people in football, that it sparked complaints from other clubs to the Premier League, and Newcastle are still awaiting to hear whether the Premier League will carry out a full investigation into the deal. The Vlachodimos fee may well prove to be the straw that broke the camel's back, ruining the fun for all of the other clubs who, allegedly, have been getting away with it, with more plausible transfer fees in their mutually beneficial deals, completed conspicuously close to the PSR deadline, with clubs also at risk of breaching PSR. It should be noted that this isn't a totally new phenomenon, nor is it unique to the Premier League. You may recall several raised eyebrows in the world of football when Barcelona paid a reported €65 million to sign Miralem Pjanic from Juventus, and on the very same day, Juventus paid a potential €82 million to sign Artem Melo from Barcelona. I'm not saying that anything fishy was going on there, but it certainly wasn't a bargain. Pjanic lasted a single season at Barca, in which he played 19 La Liga games, before departing on a free. Arta is still contracted to Juventus, but he has played just 42 times in Serie A in more than 4 years. It's not a great return on an overall €147 million expenditure, but hey, I suppose it had other benefits. Barcelona and Valencia's Neto and Jasper Cillessen swap deal, Man City and Juventus exchanging Cancelo and Danilo, and Chelsea and Roma's Zappacosta and Emerson swap, among others, have all raised similar suspicion. There are those, and it is typically people associated with clubs, at risk of breaching PSR, or who want to lose more money than PSR currently allows, who argue not that all of those transfers were above board, or within the spirit of the rules, but that it is the rules themselves that are wrong, and that if we are seeing third-choice goalkeepers moving clubs for £20 million, or clubs with rich owners forced to sell academy graduates that they would rather keep in order to comply with the rules, it is the rules that ought to change, not how these clubs operate. On the flip side, those more often than not affiliated with rival clubs, who spend within their means and haven't had to engage in inventive accounting practices in order to skirt sanctions or points deductions, view it as blatant manipulation, which should either be punished or at the very least somehow prohibited from continuing. As a Hull City fan, with no dog in the fight, I of course possess the clarity that a lot of others lack on this issue. It is very obviously the club's fault, isn't it? It's deeply unethical, arguably outright cheating in the most brazen cases, and the crocodile tears about having to sell academy graduates ring a bit hollow when you only have to sell them because you've overspent on players who weren't academy graduates. Whether you agree with the rules or not, everyone knows what they are, knows what they have to do to abide by them, and if you find yourself needing to generate £60 million in player sales in 2 days, that is gross negligence and nobody's fault other than your own. That is not to say that the rules are perfect, of course, or that they haven't created a warped incentive structure that could be better addressed by a different set of regulations, and indeed, we will soon see a different set of regulations, as the Premier League adopts the UEFA model of squad cost controls, with a more targeted focus on wages, transfer expenditure and agents' fees, rather than overall operating expenses, albeit with more lenient rules than UEFA, which will fully replace the previous system from the 2025-26 Premier League season onwards. I have made a full video about that, and my thoughts on it, which I will leave a link to at the end, rather than going over it again here and making this video, which isn't specifically about that, over an hour long. Shady swap deals and allegedly inflated fees aren't the first loophole that very highly paid accountants and financial advisors at Premier League clubs have found to avoid regulatory breaches and punishments, nor will they be the last. In that sense, they are totally unremarkable. But the human aspect of some of them, of talented young players who have worked their whole lives to become footballers, being passed around like disposable pieces on a chessboard, or vastly experienced full internationals who ought to be at the peak of their powers, being parachuted from one bench to another with a flagrant disregard for their own careers, really helps to distill, I find, what a deeply depressing state of affairs football is currently in. Odysseus Vlachodimos hasn't played a single minute of Premier League football for Newcastle United this season, and he almost certainly never will. Yet, in facilitating Elliot Anderson's £35 million move to Nottingham Forest, one could argue that he has already won Eddie Howe's side 10 points this season. That is the same number as Alexander Isak. Whether you support a club that wants to spend more and feel it is your only way to compete, or a club that isn't owned by an oligarch or a nation state and needs regulation in order to be able to compete, there can't be many football fans who look at these transfers with any sense of satisfaction or who feel like this is football working as it should. But this is football now. Certainly, it is the Premier League at least. A good accountant is as important as a good centre forward, an effective legal team is as pivotal as an effective counter-press, and talented academy graduates exist not to represent your club, their club, and the place where you're from, inspiring pride in an entire fan base, but to generate pure profit before accounting deadlines. It's what the game is all about. It's the best league in the world. It's depressing. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course it goes without saying, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on not just for this channel, HITC Sevens, but also my second channel, Alfie Potts Armour, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might fancy watching after this one. You could also find me on Twitter, Instagram, Threads, and now Blue Sky. The links to those, plus a whole lot more good stuff, should be down in the video description below. Cheers. Have a great day.